Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first lecture in interpersonal communication. This lecture is introductory in that it provides just a very basic overview of some of the things that we'll be talking about this semester. So bear with me. There is a decent amount of information here, but most of it will be reiterated in future units as we progress throughout the course. I like to start off this class by asking students, are the individuals that you see across these photos communicating? Right, so we have over on the left, the bottom photo there, we have a couple potentially, or maybe they're friends. We're not really sure about the status of their relationship, right? But one of them's on the phone, the other one's kind of looking in the other direction. Just above that, you might make inferences again about the relationship between these two people. Is this a mother and a daughter? Is this like a babysitter and the kid she's babysitting? Maybe it's an older sister and a younger sister. Then over to the right, we've got Regina George from Mean Girls, the original Mean Girls film. She's obviously looking kind of angry or frustrated or potentially offended by something off screen there. And then the photo all the way to the right, you see Justin Trudeau, former Prime Minister of Canada, and he's having some kind of interaction with another guy. So you can look at each of these photos and each of these individuals, and you can make some pretty educated guesses about what they are thinking, where they are, what they're doing, how they're feeling, the relationships between the two people interacting. You might even make inferences about their mood or their personality, right? So these guesses or interpretations of what you see guide your decisions about how to interact with these individuals or even whether you would want to interact with them. So imagine you come up on these different scenarios in person and you're deciding, is this someone that I want to talk to? And if so, if I have to talk to them, how am I going to go about doing that? Your individual interpretations of what's going on in each of these circumstances may differ, but they nonetheless influence your behavior in some way. So, this example illustrates the idea that communication is more than just the exchange of written or verbal messages, and it involves more than just a socially shared symbol system or a shared language. You do not have to share a language or even a species with these individuals to be able to make sense of their behavior. For example, here we have an image of a cat. That cat is giving off some sort of feeling there, right? This is probably not a cat you want to approach. The ears are pulled back, the mouth is open, teeth are bared, eyes are slanted, right? And so just that nonverbal information and the nonverbal information you're getting from each of these photos is enough to guide your decision about whether you want to approach and interact with these individuals. So this sets the foundation for determining how we might be able to define communication broadly and also interpersonal communication more specifically. So let's start with coming to an agreement on what communication, broadly speaking, is. Typically, I would ask students for their own definitions, right? So think about how would you define communication if you were able to respond. Most students will note that communication involves both sending and receiving messages. Some students mention the various channels through which communication can occur. Some will talk about the fact that it's a way to create shared meaning between two or more people. One of the main differences in how researchers define communication is whether or not they emphasize if the communication is always intentional or not. So, in other words, do we always send messages intentionally? And do we always interpret others' messages as intentional? Ideally, you've come across the idea at some point along the way in your communication career that you cannot not communicate in face to face settings because your facial expressions, your clothing, your body language, your tone of voice, your eye contact or lack thereof, those are all things that communicate to people in your environment, whether you mean to or not. And the photos on the previous slide do a decent job of illustrating that. Early definitions of communication did, however, focus on the transmission of messages using a socially shared symbol system, or again, a shared language. And this definition that you see here ignores any messages sent and received through involuntary channels. In other words, those that reflect an individual's emotional state, like the photos you saw on the previous slide. So, our definition of communication as we approach this course will be any behavior that influences the behavior of someone else. In other words, any behavior, verbal, nonverbal, intentional, unintentional, that creates meaning for someone. So, thinking about the photos on that previous slide, you made inferences about the individuals. And if you saw them in real life, you'd probably do the same. And those inferences may determine how you interact with them or whether you interact with them at all, right? So if you think that the couple was about to have an argument, you're probably not going to ask them if they're finished with their table, right? Maybe you're looking for a seat in a crowded restaurant. They seem to not be enjoying each other's company. You're probably still going to leave them alone. If you see the cat baring their teeth, right, and the eyes widened, you're probably going to avoid them. If you saw a person making that facial expression, you would definitely avoid them as well. The thing is, your inferences about these individuals might be correct, but they might also be incorrect, right? But certain communicative cues help to reduce your uncertainty in that they help you make a decision about how to approach that situation. So your inferences don't necessarily have to be accurate. They just have to be useful in helping you make a decision. So communication is any behavior that creates meaning for you or for someone um, else in your environment. One could argue that interpersonal communication is the backbone of, or certainly central to, other types of communication. So if you look at this graphic here, you can see intercultural communication, mediated communication, group communication, then interpersonal, and then intrapersonal. So aside from the intrapersonal level, which is communication that occurs with yourself, interpersonal communication is the most intimate with the fewest amount of people involved, and it can occur in a variety of contexts, ultimately influencing or reinforcing cultural practices. So it might seem like our media communicate from the top down, directly speaking to us, but those ideas that we are exposed to um, in these mediated interactions certainly get challenged or reinforced at the interpersonal level when you interact with others on a daily basis, right? So it's through social interaction and coordination with others that we really make sense of our world. And culture is, of course, our largest social context in which all communication occurs. And it influences the ways in which we communicate with one another and how we interpret various messages that are sent in our direction. So, moving from the broad definition of communication, right, as any behavior that creates meaning for someone, let's focus specifically on interpersonal communication. Interestingly, we've been communicating interpersonally for, forever, right? But we haven't always studied what that looks like, or maybe what it's supposed to look like. In the 1960s, scholars finally realized that most communication takes place in small groups and in dyads with close friends, family members, romantic partners. But before that, most communication researchers were focused on public speeches, the rhetoric used to communicate in those speeches, as well as mass media or mediated communication. So the study of interpersonal communication eventually began to focus on how people communicate in dyads, or how two people communicate with one another. Interpersonal communication is best understood as something that occurs and is interpreted in the context of the relationship between two people. So let's start there. Let's start by distinguishing between what impersonal communication is, and what we will eventually come to know as interpersonal communication. So, interpersonal communication is loosely defined as the exchange of verbal and nonverbal messages between two people. You can have a variety of interpersonal interactions on a daily basis. Some of them are going to be more meaningful than others. But when you relate to someone based solely on the role they are inhabiting, we call that impersonal communication, though it technically fits within this definition of interpersonal communication. So it's useful then to look at how a role relationship differs from an interpersonal relationship, which has more defined characteristics. So, the very basic ingredient for any kind of relationship is that two people share some degree of behavioral interdependence. This means one person's behavior affects the other person and vice versa. If behavioral interdependence is the only thing you have, though, it probably is not an interpersonal relationship. This is a role relationship, right? So these are interactions that typically help you accomplish a task, right? Like exchanging money for coffee or groceries. So the interaction you have when you order your breakfast and coffee at Dunkin', the interaction you have with the clerk at the grocery store. These are all helping you to accomplish the task of acquiring that coffee. And they're really just kind of functional interactions. And they don't typically progress beyond just that type of interaction. So that's a role relationship. There is behavioral interdependence, but it's not meaningful. Role relationships are often temporary, and the individuals within them are interchangeable and not very unique, right? So one person in a role relationship can probably easily be replaced by another person. So, in other words, when you get that coffee at Dunkin', it doesn't really matter who's standing behind the desk asking you for your order and giving you your order and taking your money. It really doesn't matter who does that. So the interactants are interchangeable, and that relationship is temporary, unless, of course, it goes beyond just this type of interaction. So to qualify as an interpersonal relationship, you go beyond basic behavioral interdependence, um, and these relationships are characterized by mutual influence that is meaningful. So influential activities create a connection at a social or an emotional level, rather than just the sole purpose of completing a given task. Sorry. These are relationships that are characterized by self-disclosure, right? So sharing information um, with another person, and um, social and emotional support. So that's kind of what I mean by mutual influence. Interpersonal relationships also, or the people within them, have an interaction history. The interactions that are limited just to that kind of like behavioral interdependence type of situation are rarely going to develop into an interpersonal relationship. So interpersonal relationships are characterized by repeated interactions over time. And these relationships are unique in that the way you communicate with one person may be different in some ways than the way you communicate with others because of that unique relationship history. Right? So you may have shared experiences, inside jokes, knowledge of private information, and all of those things shape how two people communicate with one another. So communication that occurs in role relationships is relatively impersonal, while the communication that occurs in interpersonal relationships is more along the lines of what we consider to be interpersonal communication. So that brings us to another type of relationship and a subset of interpersonal communication called relational communication. So, close relationships have all of the characteristics of interpersonal relationships. So, those characteristics, as we just learned, were mutual influence, unique and repeated interactions. But close relationships have three additional qualities: emotional attachment. So, we feel emotionally connected to the other person. The relationship is the basis of why we feel various emotions: happy, sad, proud, so on. Irreplaceability. So these people inhabit a special place in your life, right? So it might be your first love, your best friend, or a mentor. You may have many romantic partners throughout your life, but each one is likely important and unique and something that you will remember. So, in that sense, these are people who are irreplaceable to you. And finally, close relationships are characterized by the fact that this is where your personal needs are fulfilled. Now, all of your relationships fulfill some sort of need, but your closest relationships fulfill needs that are more central and more personal. And those needs are needs for affection, inclusion, and control, which I will explain on the next slide. Relational communication, then, is a subset of interpersonal communication that focuses primarily on the verbal and nonverbal messages exchanged in close relationships. So they can be vital relational messages, things like saying, I love you to another person, but they can also be just like regular everyday talk, right? So if you talk to a parent every day, for example, right, that's more of a like routine behavior. The lines between role relationships, interpersonal relationships, and close relationships can be very blurry at times, and there are a few reasons for that. First of all, relationships or all relationships start somewhere. So you don't just jump straight from strangers to friends. There's usually some kind of like gradual relationship development process. Secondly, your relationship with anyone is at least partly defined by your role, right? So your relationship with your sister, if you have one, is defined partially by your role as a sibling. Behavioral interdependence characterizes all of these relationships, but as you move from that role relationship to the interpersonal relationship to the close relationship, the interdependence becomes more enduring and it occurs in many different ways. So you might work together to reach shared goals like saving up money to buy a house, starting a family, or you might rely on each other for emotional support in times of distress, or you look to each other for some perspective or advice. And so most of this course will focus on relational communication and close relationships. So I mentioned before, our close relationships fulfill three primary needs or three central needs. And those needs are affection, inclusion, and control. So the need for affection is satisfied through our ability to basically love and be loved, right? So it's the need to give and receive physical affection, verbal praise, and approval. There's a theory called affection exchange theory that we'll talk about later on in this semester that posits that both giving and receiving affection improves psychological and physical health as well as relationship satisfaction. Um, so it's one of those like central needs that all human beings, most human beings anyway, um, crave. The need for social inclusion is basically reflects that desire to be invited and included and considered, right? The need to seek out other people. So feeling like you're part of a group satisfies safety and survival needs. Ideally, you feel secure in your family, for example. And your chances of survival are greater within a group. We have less potential for survival, creativity, innovation as individuals than we do in relationships. And if you think about it, that makes sense because we evolved as members of, hunting and gathering clans. So, of course, we want to belong to other groups. We want to belong to sports teams. We want to participate in clubs. We have our own social groups. It also explains why we seek out romantic relationships. These types of things help to prevent loneliness and act as a buffer to low self esteem. And the third need fulfilled in close relationships is the need for behavioral control. Um, so there's kind of a tension that exists here. In interpersonal relationships, we often have to share control, right? So we make decisions together. Partners who share tasks and resources in a fair manner are have reported feeling more satisfied in their relationships than those who feel like they lack control or are denied free choice. So we need some degree of autonomy and control in our relationships, but that can sometimes compete against that need for connectedness as well, which we'll get to later on in the semester. But when you feel like you lack control, you might use destructive tactics to regain that control, right? So um, maybe your partner insists that you attend a family gathering that you really don't want to go to, so you act out in some way. Maybe you complain the whole time. Maybe you spend the whole time you're at this event on your phone, right? Really not interacting with other people. Um, so those are the three basic needs fulfilled in close relationships. And again, this is kind of an innate human drive. So we seek out close relationships to help us fulfill those needs. So to kind of bring what we've talked about so far together, human beings are social creatures, and we feel kind of bad when we can't be with the people who are closest to us. When our relationships are good, we feel great. And when they're not going so great, we feel terrible. And that's natural. That's instinctive. That's not something that you learned. So, our closest relationships really do provide our life with meaning, and they can be the source of the best things that we experience, but also the source of the things that can hurt us the most. The people you're closest to can hurt you in ways that other people can't. Now, when we hear people talk about close relationships, we might assume that we're talking about dating or like romantic relationships or marital relationships. And unfortunately, most of the research does focus on those types of relationships. But there are many different types of relationships that qualify as close relationships. Your friends, your siblings, parents, and other family members, maybe a coworker or a mentor or a lover. It doesn't necessarily have to be someone that you're committed to. Um, but these relationships are not mutually exclusive. Blended relationships, or we may experience different types of relationships or blended relationships that have fuzzy boundaries. So, for example, your sister might also be your best friend. Your coworker could eventually become a romantic partner. And that can create some uncertainty about how to behave appropriately, right? So, if you, for example, date a coworker, how do you behave in the office compared to when you are interacting in a more casual setting, right? So, the different relationship types can can become confusing at times because they overlap with one another. It's also important to think of relationships outside of what we might consider to be most common or mainstream. Romantic relationships, for example, between people who do not identify as heterosexual, friendships between older and younger people, blended families and single parent families, polyamorous romantic relationships, consensual non monogamous relationships, right? So, all of these relationships um, are unfortunately overlooked both in our everyday conversations, but also in the research. Specifically, we know a lot more about monogamous heterosexual romantic relationships than any other type of romantic relationship. And we know more about relationships among college students in the United States than people of different ages and in other parts of the world. And so, attention to and acceptance of these relationships is improving in some cases. But what you're going to find is that most of the discussion in the research, and therefore the textbook for this course, revolves around more traditional relationship types. Um, for example, as of 2016, only about 2% of the relationship research in the top two relationship journals focused on relationships among non heterosexual individuals. Most relationships, regardless of who comprises them, share some characteristics or some similarities, right? The people in them love and care for each other. They look out for each other. They support each other. They get in arguments. They navigate conflict. They commit transgressions. They make up and break up, so on and so forth. So the thing that differs really is the societal pressures that may influence the formation of those relationships, as well as how they are maintained and how likely they are to survive. So, heterosexual couples and people who share things like culture, race or ethnicity, religion, biological parents, um, don't have to deal with the same pressures as people in those other types of relationships that are often overlooked. And it's not to say, I want to be very clear, that these relationships are problematic or weird, but the people in them are different than what we would traditionally see represented in the media or what we maybe encounter or experience most often in our own personal lives. And that's something we need to keep in mind as we examine the communication that occurs in different types of relationships. So, in other words, we should be mindful of the fact that not all experiences and viewpoints are represented in our research on close relationships, and therefore not all research findings may be completely generalizable to people who exist in the margins. There are scholars who aim to critique the existing theories and the scholarship that has overlooked some of these experiences. And so I encourage you, this is my first homework assignment. As we progress throughout the semester, I would love for you all to take a moment and step back from what we're learning and figure out, who does this apply to? Does it apply to me? Does it apply to somebody different from me? Um, how can I maybe critique this theory or this concept to make it more understandable to people who are maybe different than I am? All right, so this is sort of like starting part two of this lecture. I am going to move pretty quickly through the next few slides because what follows really should mostly be a review from COM 1000. So I'll give you a list of concepts on each slide, and you should ask questions if you have them. So what I'm going to do is talk about the 6 principles of interpersonal communication, which you can see listed here on the screen. I'll focus on each one. And again, if there's something in these slides that you don't recognize or that you have questions about, feel free to reach out and let me know. So, the first principle of interpersonal communication is that it consists of both verbal and nonverbal messages. Remember that communication is any behavior that creates meaning for someone, and that includes spontaneous messages like emotional expressions, right? So we looked at photos of people and animals earlier. We interpreted the situation based on what we could see, what they were kind of putting out into the environment. Some of those were, some of those nonverbal cues were intentional, but some of them were not. Your emotional expressions, for example, might be spontaneous because they reflect truly what you're feeling inside in response to something in your environment, but some of your nonverbal communication is directly tied to language or it's strategic and intentional, like what you choose to wear or how you style your hair. So the distinction between verbal communication and nonverbal communication is pretty simplistic to fully capture our definition of communication. And it's unfortunately the result of those early definitions that emphasize communication as being intentional and strategic and among people who share a language. So, some relevant concepts here that you might want to go back to from COM 1000 would be symbolic and spontaneous communication, as well as pseudo spontaneous communication. You might want to check back on the triangle of meaning, as well as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. The second principle of interpersonal communication is that it is inevitable. In other words, you cannot not communicate, particularly in face to face settings, but really in any setting in which you have access to nonverbal information. We communicate nonverbally through many cues across many channels, including the channels that you see listed here at the bottom of the screen. All of these nonverbal behaviors communicate something, and all can be enacted strategically and rely on a socially shared symbol system, or they might be enacted involuntarily and are interpreted universally independent of language or culture, but they all communicate something to the people in your environment. If you are interested in learning more about nonverbal communication, please enroll in COM 3240, which I have been teaching for the past few semesters. This is our nonverbal communication course. It is my area of expertise. So it is a course that is not only important to me, but it's also one that I very much enjoy teaching. So keep that in mind as you're looking for a class next semester. The third principle of interpersonal communication is that people use it to fulfill their goals. When interpersonal communication is strategic and intentional, we are typically using it to fulfill a particular goal, and there are kind of three main types of goals that we might fulfill. We have self presentation goals, which are goals related to your image. You want people to see you the way that you want to be seen, right? It could be context or relationship dependent, but usually we're trying to create a positive impression. This is why you put time and effort into like first dates or job interviews or meeting your partner's parents for the first time. And the same is true for mediated contexts. You craft your own social media profiles, or even the way you structure the textual elements of a text message, right? Do you abbreviate words? Do you use emojis? Do you add LOL after every text message, right? You may have self presentation goals related to your professional image, right? So, self presentation goals are all about the image you're trying to convey to a particular audience. And we'll talk about that more in Unit 2. Relational goals are related to feelings. So, these are goals related to initiating, escalating, maintaining, de escalating a relationship. Um, there are also goals related to belonging and connecting to others, right? So being invited to do things with your friends, celebrating significant occasions. And they are also goals related to affection and intimacy. So your relational goals are the things you do to keep that relationship intact and in a pleasing state. And finally, we have instrumental goals, which are related to accomplishing tasks. So, acquiring a date to a party, coping with a problem in a relationship might all be instrumental goals. We pretty regularly seek advice and assistance and possibly permission from others to facilitate achieving those instrumental goals. So, it's important to remember that we can have goals, but not always reach them, but we are more likely to reach them when our communication is effective. The fourth principle is that interpersonal communication varies in effectiveness, and certainly the most effective messages are the ones that lead to shared meaning. We're going to define shared meaning as a circumstance when a receiver understands the message in the way that the sender intended for them to. So basically, trying to understand where someone is coming from, which is often easier said than done. Our communication is rarely perfect, of course, but the goal is for both people to interpret a given communication behavior similarly. There's a model in your textbook that identifies 6 behaviors that vary on 2 dimensions related to effectiveness, intentionality in communicating, and then the receiver's accuracy in interpreting. The model in the book is fine, but it's inconsistent with what you should already know about symbolic and spontaneous communication. It's also inconsistent with our definition of communication to some extent. So I'm going to skip over that model, but you're welcome to take a look at it if it's useful to you. Essentially, I think you should just know that sometimes your message isn't interpreted the way your conversational partner intended, um, which results in miscommunication. You could also unintentionally communicate something which someone picks up on and interprets accurately or inaccurately, or someone may interpret something you did that you didn't even realize um, that you did or that you even meant to do. The fifth principle of interpersonal communication is that messages contain both content and relational information, which should be concepts that you are already familiar with. So, the effectiveness of our communication is often influenced by the clarity of the words we use or the context in which the message is sent and received. Um, so the content level of meaning is kind of like the literal meaning of the message, whereas the relational meaning it is paying attention to the context in which the message was sent, right? The relationship between the two people, the actual physical environment in which they are communicating, things like that. And finally, our last principle is that interpersonal communication can be symmetrical or it can be asymmetrical. And this principle emphasizes the dyadic nature of interpersonal communication, in that communication unfolds as a series of messages and responses that contribute to our understanding of the interaction. So, when you exchange similar relational information or similar messages, that would be symmetrical communication. So if I say I love you and you say I love you too, those are symmetrical. We're communicating very similar messages. When you exchange different kinds of information, so maybe the messages are opposite in meaning or they differ in the level of certainty with which each person engages in a particular behavior, those would be asymmetrical. So if I confess my love to someone and then they say, I don't feel the same way, those are asymmetrical messages, very different messages. Um, so some of our messages might be similar or we may respond to them similarly, or we may respond to them very differently. So again, this was supposed to be a quick overview, kind of just lay the groundwork for what we're talking about for the rest of the semester. There are a number of ideas that we have already covered that are going to come up in the next unit. And uncertainty is one. We have an entire unit devoted to uncertainty, but that's going to permeate our conversations probably for the entire semester. So if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you back here for Unit 2.